You don't look like you belong in here unless you're here to wipe these seats. The words slid out of Officer Logan Rourke's mouth and hit the black woman like spit, right there where justice was supposedly sacred. But this time, he'd picked the wrong target. That lazy flick of his hand, that practiced sneer, got answered minutes later with a strike that dropped him harder than any gavel. What happens when the quiet one finally swings back? From the second the courtroom door creaked open, Rourke's gaze locked onto the woman stepping inside. Each step she took sounded to him like an insult. White button-down, pressed black slacks, flat shoes, braids pulled tight against her head. To him, that neatness wasn't professionalism. It was arrogance. He shifted directly into her path, palm resting on the duty belt where his pistol hung loose. His eyes swept from collar to shoes, stopping pointedly on her dark skin. You don't look like you belong here, unless you're here to clean the chairs. His tone was flat, dead-eyed, like a line he'd rehearsed all morning, waiting for the first excuse to humiliate someone. A clerk started forward, caught Rourke's stare, retreated. She didn't drop her gaze, didn't shrink. Instead, she offered him a perfectly folded document, crease razor straight, a federal summons, embossed and signed. Rourke didn't bother to read. He waved it away, almost slapping it from her hand. Paper doesn't change your skin color. He said it slowly, clearly, loud enough for people 10 feet away to hear. A female officer at the scanner glanced up, hesitated, then looked away, focusing hard on nothing at all. The hallway went quiet, like a play everyone had seen too often to bother reacting. She slipped the summons back into her pocket. Her eyes stayed fixed between Rourke's eyebrows, unblinking. The silence irritated him. From her, silence wasn't respect. It was resistance. "You hear me?" he snapped. "I said you don't belong here." He leaned hard on belong, like he was correcting a stubborn child. People on the benches peeked up, then buried themselves in their phones again. An older woman flipped through her notebook with shaking hands, eyes flicking to the cuffs swinging from Rourke's belt. Some had watched him use those like a club. The witness shifted half a step right. Rourke mirrored her, blocking her path again. The hallway shrank to just the two of them. 10 seconds of standoff stretched thin. The vein in his neck throbbed. She stayed still. She knew his type, knew that with people of color, it rarely stopped at taunts. Shoves came next, then dragging. If anyone resisted, he'd howl, assaulting an officer, and any video would get buried under internal memos and staged apologies. But today his target wasn't like the others. She hadn't come begging for a seat. She'd been ordered here. She carried more than that summons. She carried training, the kind that teaches which limits are real and which are traps dressed up as rules. Rourke leaned closer, voice dropping. "You think a white shirt makes you a lawyer?" Another overconfident black type. "You know how long you last?" Still, she didn't answer. But there was one fact the room didn't know yet. This was the last day Logan Rourke got to choose whether he walked out upright or broken. And he chose wrong. By the metal detector, a mid-30s staffer clutched his clipboard, watching. Her white shirt had become the subject of judgment, not because it violated dress code, but because of the body wearing it. He stepped forward, voice barely steady. She's a special witness, Sergeant." Summoned by... Rourke spun around before he finished. Fury flared in his eyes. His breath, hot and stained with stale tobacco, hit the staffer's face. "You're calling this one a witness?" he muttered, low but lethal. He didn't need to shout. His voice slid straight into the obedience instinct in everyone lower ranked. The staffer froze, apology choking off. Around them, people looked away, screens suddenly urgent. They'd learned early, never step between a cop and his target, especially when that target doesn't share your skin. She stayed still, didn't glance back at the staffer, but she stored him in memory. Close haircut, narrow shoulders, worn black shoes, tiny hunch as he spoke. She wasn't angry with him. She'd remember. She walked past Rourke like he was a boulder, not an obstacle with a badge. He drifted closer, fingers tightening around the belt near his Glock. She didn't break stride. He almost blocked her again, but a passing judge's glance froze him. His power reached far down that hallway, but never past the bench where that man sat. Inside the courtroom, she scanned the space. Heavy green curtains, pale wooden rails around the jury, desks spaced perfect, the witness chair sitting exposed in the center. That chair was where people were summoned, questioned, dissected, then quietly dismissed. She'd learned early, a courtroom isn't neutral. It's built to expose, control, and sometimes break. She wasn't just observing, she was recording. Every face, every micro-expression, the slick smirk of an older lawyer with a gold watch, the eye roll from a younger female officer, the clerk's flat indifference. She didn't need names. She could already tell who would stay quiet if she was dragged, who'd falsify a note, who'd claim confusion. A sign behind the bench read, "Silence is respect." She paused, not because she agreed, but because it revealed the room's truth better than any oath. Here, silence didn't mean respect. It meant compliance. Rourke stayed outside, but his presence stalked her thoughts. The way he filled space, cut people off, treated existence as his right. Men like him didn't need reasons to hate her. The system had already supplied one. Skin color was enough. She sat at the witness stand, fingers tapping the rail softly. From the back, Rourke entered and took a seat along the aisle, close enough to interfere whenever he liked. He leaned back, crossed his leg, never took his eyes off her. She didn't look his way. She didn't have to. She knew his type. Men like that never watched out of curiosity. They watched to make sure what they called beneath them never dared rise. She exhaled slowly. From here on, every second in that room would be etched into her memory, not theirs. Rourke strode to the center with the swagger of someone praised too often for maintaining control. A stack of loose files slapped softly in his hands, each page flap a little performance. He cleared his throat, reading louder than necessary. Black, female, civilian, unknown employment history. The lines sounded neutral on paper. In his mouth, every word was a blade. He tossed off the first three like labels, then iced the rest. A juror frowned but stayed quiet. No one corrected his wording. It had become routine. Rourke folded the file and kept it rather than returning it. He stepped closer to the witness. His expression hovered between condescension and interrogation. "What district are you from?" he asked, turning to the clerk before she could answer. "Need it for civil verification." Silence. He rotated back, slowing his speech. "Right. Poor districts don't always have proper records." The phrase landed heavy for anyone from places stamped poor. In this system, insults came gift-wrapped in job titles, and people pretended not to hear. She stayed still, not because his words didn't hit, but because none were new. Every sentence flashed more about the system protecting him than about her. His insults were stale wind. She'd trained herself to let that gust blow past. Rourke paced like he was doing rounds at a prison. He leaned toward a camera monitor and barked, "Have you ever held legal employment before this?" Some thought he meant job history. Others caught the subtext, that without credentials, she wasn't worthy of respect. She adjusted her collar, not from offense, but to regulate her body temperature. Training had drilled in. Rage narrows vision. Surrounded by rotten language, wrapped in legality, let the anger sink low and wait. He tossed the file down like trash. He glanced at the judge, then back at her, as if he needed one more flourish. "Is there a number we can call? Or do people like you just make things up and vanish after court?" The question wasn't for an answer. It was meant to slice dignity into smaller pieces. Under fluorescent lights, the most honest thing in the room wasn't a badge or file. It was his attempt to erase her name with carefully chosen words. She stared upward toward the ceiling. The lights were designed to cast no shadows, leaving everything exposed, just like the courtroom's real nature. Rourke took a seat near internal affairs, draping his arm as though he owned the hearing. Papers fluttered in his hands as he scanned the room for new targets. She sat upright, hands resting on her lap, eyes on the edge of the witness table. She knew she was the room's focal point, yet anything she said had already been stripped away when she walked in. What remained was their label, an unknown black woman wrapped in procedures designed to excuse contempt. She stayed quiet like someone walking through a minefield. Each jab from Rourke, each laugh, each indifferent shrug from staff was another half-pulled pin, left visible but never detonated. The collapse of the room's integrity didn't come suddenly. It was choreographed. The drawn-out roll call, the empty questions, every gesture aimed to shrink her into an example of expendability. The audience wasn't outsiders. The courtroom itself was the crowd. Some scribbled. Some scrolled their phones. A few smirked at his poor district line. Everyone played their role in a silent play where the humiliated lead had no voice. No one questioned why he spoke about a witness's identity like that. No one admitted how normal black bodies as default targets had become. She scanned the jury. An older woman in red velvet watched her with troubled eyes, head shaking slightly. Maybe it was sympathy, maybe anger, but it never reached action. In that comfortable silence, people justified their inaction. They weren't cruel, they told themselves, just avoiding conflict. Conscience folded like their files. Rourke needed nothing else. He knew that once the room tilted right, the victim shrank by design. She understood if she spoke, her words would be twisted. Her testimony would be reframed as reaction. And when black people react in court, it's labeled threat. So she stayed quiet. Silence, for her, became strategy, a way to record every face. Each move he made added evidence. While the court thought it was hearing one case, she was noting another indictment, not for the judge, but for the moment when people above them would finally be forced to look straight at this room. Rourke slowed as he approached, polished shoes tapping like a countdown. The air, already thick with half-guilty, half-entertained stares, bent around his looming presence. He leaned in, stooping low beside her, turning a minor movement into a human-shaped threat. "Ever heard gunfire?" he murmured. "Or are you just good at staying quiet to stay alive?" His breath, sticky with cigarettes and microwaved food, brushed her neck. He didn't care about her answer. Domination without fingerprints, that was the goal. She kept her eyes forward. Not defiant, disciplined. Keep the airway open, don't let anger clog thought. She knew his flavor of power, men who rose by pressing others under. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last, unless something changed. Behind her, another officer muttered to Rourke, words buried under paper rustle and air vents. Was she forced to come? The last two words carried an inside joke lilt. They chuckled quietly, just loud enough for a nearby clerk to hear and look away. In a room named for justice, that laugh might have been the most honest sound. Rourke straightened, adjusted his belt, scraped a hand down his face. He'd said what he needed to say, not to threaten, but to stake dominance. In his world, cruelty wrapped in procedure was just scene setting for molding the narrative. If she felt fear, he'd won. If she reacted, he'd twisted into instability. Every version ended with him on top. It was a script he'd rehearsed for years. He nodded to the judge and moved back, like checking a box on a form. She didn't turn. She cataloged every step, every smirk. None of it would show up in official transcripts, but in her memory, it was already carved. The fluorescent light stayed evenly bright, leaving no corners to hide in. Yet everyone still found shadows, titles to duck behind, silence to retreat into, vague nods to mask unease. Rourke stood directly in the open glow because he knew no one questioned him. She lifted her chin slightly, adjusted her collar again, not to look composed, but to stay balanced. Language here wasn't for truth. It was for control. Men like him built walls out of words, dividing us from them. She knew another truth. Any wall built on humiliation eventually cages its builder. The room settled, pretending nothing had happened. Then a little folded note drifted through the air, brushed her sleeve, and dropped onto the floor with a small, sharp sound. One guard pretended he hadn't noticed. Another bent to tie a shoe. She picked up the note, unfolded it steadily. Blue ink rushed male handwriting. Go back to the jungle. Jungle was smudged. The meaning was not. No joke. A belief. She refolded it, set it on the desk. Her hands relaxed, but her gaze changed. Less guarded, more final, like a switch had flipped. Rourke noticed. He didn't ask. His shoulders eased, satisfied with the silence he thought he'd engineered. The real harm wasn't the insult, it was the feeling of being surrounded with no nameable enemy. A woman in the third row frowned, then buried her face in her bag. She'd seen injustice before and still didn't know what to do. At her age, comfort felt easier than truth. She stayed still. The note wasn't meant to be challenged, just to linger. Its power came from collective quiet. No one had to defend it. They just had to say nothing. A black witness demanding, "Who threw this?" would be labeled disruptive. She knew that rule and refused to play. What really shifted the room wasn't the note itself, but the way the witness looked up afterward, no longer waiting, but confronting. Rourke leaned back, watching. He searched for a crack, rage, fear. Some tell. All he saw was solid silence. The note stayed on the table between her documents like a quiet charge, unspoken, unfiled, yet shaping every breath she took. From then on, she wasn't just testifying about one case. She was testifying against the system that allowed that note, that let it appear and vanish without consequence. When the hearing ended, others would leave. She'd carry what they refused to face. The questioning paused. The judge announced a 10-minute break. Lawyers stacked files, jurors stretched, side conversations rose. She stayed in the witness chair, not because she wasn't ready to leave, but because Rourke blocked the aisle. Arms folded, stance wide. From a distance, it looked casual, like he was chatting. But his stare never wavered from her. Sharp, unblinking, wordless threat. She straightened her notes, stacked them with deliberate precision, and rose. Rourke moved in, cutting off her exit. His eyes flicked to her hand, like even lifting paper required his approval. You haven't been dismissed. Sit down. The room froze again. The clerk looked up mid-sentence, then scribbled nonsense. A younger officer twitched forward, then stopped under Rourke's glare. She neither stepped back nor obeyed. Her breathing stayed even. Eyes on his, her posture didn't change. The silence between them stretched tight, like wire drawn to breaking. Rourke stepped closer, shrinking the air between them without touching. For the moment, everyone else is on break, he murmured. Not you. We've got more to verify. Who's we? She asked, voice level. He smirked. You know who. A man 2 rows back cleared his throat, not quite protest, but enough to be heard. Rourke never turned. He didn't need to. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew his voice was treated as policy. No one above him stepped in. Maybe they weren't there. Maybe they chose not to be. She stepped half a pace back, eyes never leaving his. How long are you planning on keeping me here? Until I'm finished, he sneered. Or until you learn to wait. Her gaze drifted from him to the gallery. A brown-skinned student watched, unflinching. He didn't look away or lower his head. For the first time that morning, someone watched openly. That was enough. She wouldn't retreat, wouldn't slip around Rourke, wouldn't wait for him to move. If he stood there all day, she'd outlast him. She spoke softly, each word placed like a marker. I don't need your permission to stand here, or to move. It wasn't defiance, it was basic truth. But in this layered hierarchy, even truth sounded like rebellion when directed at him. She spoke slowly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, just firm enough to stall their keystrokes. Rourke tilted his head, narrowing his eyes. He didn't smile. Instead, he closed the gap and set his right hand heavy on her left shoulder. Not a reminder, a message. You do in here, he growled. His grip bore down, pushing her toward the seat he thought she deserved. From the jury box, an older man glanced over, then quickly looked away, pretending he'd misread everything. She didn't sit immediately. Her shoulder tensed, then settled. She breathed through it, eyes forward, as if his hand were just a misfired movement in a huge machine. The only person convinced he was in control was Rourke. He gave one last push, then let go, stepping aside with a smirk. He expected her to flinch, retreat, crumble. She didn't. Her folder stayed neat, her pen exactly where it was. His behavior wasn't a slip. It was habit. A tap on the shoulder here, a joke elbow there, a stare held just too long, all shielded later by phrases like processing error or no harmful intent. She knew her shoulder could answer. Her hands could drop him in 2 seconds, but not today. If she struck first, all eyes would land on her. The only thing they'd remember was the movement of her body, not the hand that shoved it. A clerk had seen everything, pen hovering above the timestamp box, frozen. He didn't write. No one wanted to be first with the truth. In this system, people who documented reality disappeared before the ink dried. Rourke waved to a colleague near the door, grinning like they'd shared a private joke. He believed what he'd done was standard, necessary, that a black woman sitting too straight in court was more threat than viewpoint. She sat when she chose, not because of his shove, but because she needed to keep watching. His moves didn't weaken her. They clarified everything. In her mind, pieces clicked. The stare, the papers, the offhand phrases, the pressure that pressed memory into stone. She didn't write any of it. She stored it where no one could edit it. That gave her a calm deeper than rage. Rourke's hand had pressed hard into her shoulder, unprovoked, unapologetic, confident no consequences would follow. His thumbnail dug into fabric, thumb jamming into muscle like he was testing what sat under her skin. He leaned in so close their cheeks nearly brushed. I've hit stray dogs harder than that, he muttered. His voice came out rough, gravel dragged across concrete. Every syllable soaked in contempt he'd practiced over years of getting away with it. He didn't bother hiding anything, not the insult, not the threat. Why would he? In here, nobody checked him. He spoke freely, knowing the system's silence would carry his words for him. His breath reeked of smoke and chemicals, entitlement gone sour. She didn't pull away. Her head stayed level, face steady. She only altered her breathing, keeping her airway clear despite the stink. Looking into his eyes taught her nothing anymore. They'd turned into walls decorated with slogans he'd been fed for years. He held his position one beat too long, then gave another shove before straightening. No apology, no explanation. What he left behind wasn't just tenderness in the muscle, it was a shock that snapped the room into focus. A witness, supposedly safest person in this space, had been reduced to something less than human by someone wearing the law. No one intervened. The stenographer paused 3 seconds, then kept typing. A guard glanced over, then checked the digital schedule again. A lawyer paused mid-sentence, quietly sat down instead of stepping forward. Their reactions were trained. See, understand, step back. She held her spine straight, same as when she walked in. The pain wasn't from his grip. It was from the confirmation. Confirmation that even under bright light, this place nourished darkness. Darkness that spoke, touched, crossed boundaries without leaving evidence, without punishment. She drew a slow breath, steadying lungs against the urge to recoil. Her right hand tightened on the desk edge, not preparing to strike, anchoring herself. Everything else was warping under distorted authority. Rourke marched back to his seat, shoulders squared, satisfaction twitching across his posture. To him, she was still just another witness. But in acting like this, he'd signed an indictment with his own name, not yet filed. She watched him, closing a chapter, not about injustice, but about the beginning of reckoning. Not against one man, but against a whole language left unanswered. A middle-aged man in a light brown suit shifted forward when Rourke pushed her shoulder. Not a reflex, but an instinct. He'd seen something so wrong, it pulled his body out of stillness. His hand gripped the seat in front, mouth parting to speak. Rourke turned, uncoupling his handcuffs and raising them easily, letting the metal dangle. "Sit down. This isn't your business." No shouting, just enough force to freeze the man mid-lean. He stopped, back still bent, eyes wide, not at the cuffs, but at the truth. In a space called a courtroom, Rourke could threaten anyone not in uniform with that little piece of metal. It hovered like a warning about when to stay silent. He didn't need to swing. Just raising it told everyone who controlled speech. The man sat back down. His shoulders drooped under a weight no one asked him to carry. He no longer looked at Rourke or the witness. He stared at his knees, quietly building excuses for his silence. Maybe he'd call it job security. Maybe he'd try making up for it later with an anonymous post or hushed conversation. But in that moment, it was clear. When authority raised the cuff, principle sat down. Rourke holstered the restraints and turned away, routine complete. He didn't bother glancing back. The hesitation he'd triggered was predictable, proof the system worked the way he wanted. She didn't need to watch. She registered every movement through a different sense, years of training that noticed without staring. Inside her, something else began. A memory from deployment snapped into focus, like a tape suddenly replaying. Dusty corridor, distant explosions, right hand wrapped around a weapon, left fingers curling, joint by joint, ready to strike if surrounded. Those drills weren't theory. They'd been hammered into muscle so the body would remember when the mind flooded. Under these white lights in this courtroom, her left hand began to tighten. It wasn't trembling, it was preparing. Anyone trained would recognize it. Her index pressed into her palm, thumb locking against her middle finger, wrist taut, elbow angled. The room's attention still hovered on Rourke, or away from him. But for someone who'd served with her, that arm position screamed one thing: ready! She stared at Rourke's back. No rage, no second thoughts. Just someone stepping past the point of no return. Every insult, shove, and cuff threat had crossed the last line. His shoes hit the floor harder, returning, like he sensed the shift. The words, the shoulder grab, the stare, none of it satisfied the hunger that had grown inside him. He needed a final act to reassert control. Without warning, he seized her wrist and yanked her from the chair. Pens and papers flew. Her metal watch smacked the table edge with a sharp clang that sliced through the murmur. She staggered but didn't fall. Muscle memory kept her upright as her shoulder burned. "Well? Stand up, or should I carry you?" His voice dripped taunt. Everyone heard him. No one would later admit it. A lawyer across the room flinched, hand frozen over an open folder. They all saw. None moved. In this kind of game, the first to step forward was the first to be blamed. Rourke's grip tightened, nails biting her wrist like punctuation in a sentence written with pressure instead of ink. "People like you live off pity," he hissed. In his mind, black people didn't deserve pity unless they bowed and smiled through it. She turned to him, eyes neither pleading nor furious. They were sharp, surgical, like a needle slipping into skin. Rourke faltered for half a second. His hold loosened. The clerk started to rise, but a guard's subtle glance froze her. Everyone knew what they should do. No one wanted to go first. The air thickened like a lid pressed down on boiling water. One twitch away from eruption, she pulled her hand back, slow and firm, her wrist sliding from his grip. When she did, her gaze changed from guarded to calculating distance. Rourke stepped back just a fraction. For anyone trained, that tiny retreat was everything. It meant the threat had finally registered. Her left thumb locked silently into combat position. He said nothing, turned away with a click of his tongue like a disappointed director. But he knew, and so did she, that he'd tugged the last wire. He hadn't grabbed a helpless witness. He'd laid hands on someone who knew exactly how to answer. She bent to retrieve the note, folded it, and set it back. Then she straightened, tall, centered. No one asked another question. No one dared touch her again. Those who traffic in force understand one thing. Silence can be the last pause before impact. She stood there, shoulder steady after his grip, eyes locked on him. No fear, no sudden outburst. Only clarity, cutting clean like a drawn blade. Nothing left to dodge. No reason to keep pulling back. You've got the wrong script. Her voice was calm, each word precise, like truth delivered straight. Rourke blinked, not shocked, but reacting like someone realizing the scene had flipped. He'd walked in, seeing her as small. Witness, number, file. That one sentence tore his version apart. He smirked out of habit, not confidence. Upper lip curling, he stepped closer, trying one last time to reclaim the space between them. That was the last move he owned. As his foot landed, her shoulders dropped, body rotating in one fluid motion. The shift was instant, almost invisible in real time, only felt. A staffer near the door choked as Rourke suddenly stumbled. The strike came without warning or raised voice. It wasn't defense. It was a clean, practiced neutralization of a threat. Rourke's feet slid, knees buckled. He pitched backward toward the table, arms flailing for support that wasn't there. His back slammed the edge, chin clipping wood before his body spilled to the floor. The impact cracked through the room. Heads snapped up. Pens dropped and stayed down. The typist rose halfway, hands frozen above the keys. An older lawyer's glass trembled midair. The silence wasn't simple surprise. It was the shock of witnessing something they'd all assumed could never happen. She didn't move, didn't gloat. She stood grounded, feet planted, arms loose, eyes on the man crumpled in front of her. It wasn't triumph, it was consequence, built from every insult and shove they'd let pile up without challenge. Rourke lay gasping, eyes wide, more stunned than hurt. He'd ruled rooms like this for years, silencing witnesses, blocking the vulnerable mid-proceeding. He never imagined someone across from him would know exactly how to disrupt his balance with precision. Under him wasn't just cold floor, it was a system hit at a pressure point it thought untouchable. Now everyone had to ask, when did self-defense in a courtroom become the thing that left people this rattled? Her strike wasn't dramatic. No wind-up, no shout. Just a half pivot from neutral to offensive. Any seasoned operator would recognize the mechanics. No wasted motion, no opening left. Rourke stood too close, lip curling into a smug half smile as he stepped in. Before his brain could signal his arms to guard, her open palm chopped across his throat, flattening his windpipe. Not a punch, a precise strike to interrupt breath and nerve signals. His voice cut out like someone shut off a valve. In under half a second, her left elbow drove into the side of his torso, sliding between ribs into the intercostal muscles. Not heavy, but perfectly placed. His breath snapped. Legs betrayed him. Solid footing turned to sand underneath. He staggered backward, not by choice, but reflex. His back crashed against the table edge harder, thud ringing through the room like a warning shot. A guard shifted, hand on his radio, but didn't raise it. The clerk dropped her pen again. Eyes swung toward the center of the courtroom. Once neutral ground, now the fault line. She stayed exactly where she'd struck, weight slightly forward, arms relaxed but coiled enough to reset. Her body language spelled out a fluent warning, Don't touch me again. Don't order me like property. Don't assume fear equals obedience. Rourke clutched his throat, coughing, trying to drag sound back into his voice. All he produced were ragged breaths and clenched teeth. The smirk was gone, stripped clean. What remained wasn't just anger. It was humiliation, animal deep, the realization that his prey had claws. People who'd avoided her gaze now stared openly, not to help, but to witness something bursting past procedure, beyond anything a court transcript could hide. She still didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her actions were the statement. This wasn't a panicked flare. It was a measured answer, timed and executed with no hesitation. A physical verdict against abuse disguised as authority. Rourke stepped back again. His eyes scanned the room, searching for backup that suddenly felt farther away. He finally hit the truth years of unchecked power had denied him. Not everyone stays quiet. Not everyone needs permission to stand. His badge spun across the floor. It rolled, clattering near a chair leg. Those who'd rolled their eyes at his earlier jabs watched it spin. They understood it wasn't just metal moving. It was the emblem of a system exposed. Up in the corner, a camera blinked green. Nobody had thought about it in hours. It had become furniture. But now its lens held the center of the room, where Rourke had fallen. Every word, movement, shove, and strike captured without edit. Breathing turned heavy from all sides, not just his. In the back, a slightly older intern curled inward, hand over her mouth, eyes wide. She wasn't horrified by violence. She was stunned by the rarity. Someone actually standing up to raw abuse in a courtroom. The guard at the door hesitated mid-step. He looked from her to Rourke, the man everyone had been told. Leave alone. He knows the rules too well. No one had ever trained them for this, when the person they're supposed to contain is the only one protecting the line. She stayed in place, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for someone to call what just happened by its real name. No one did. The silence now wasn't complicit. It was stunned. The badge stopped rolling. No one bent to retrieve it. Rourke stared up from the floor, eyes bloodshot with anger and fear. His lips moved soundlessly, breath short. He hadn't fallen because of the force alone. He'd fallen because, for the first time, someone didn't fear him. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze moved across the room, from prosecution to defense, from court staff to stenographer, asking one wordless question. Who's still going to sit there and pretend? Formalities and protocols ripped right then. His collapse wasn't an ending. It was ignition. Every frame from those cameras, every stored clip, would stand as a reminder. Not all trials end with a gavel. Some falls need no spoken sentence because the verdict is written in the eyes of people who can't unsee what happened. A security officer strode in from the entrance, steps sharp, hand near his belt, gaze locked on the woman standing at the center. Training screamed, "Man down, civilian nearby. Move to contain." He reached towards her shoulder until a voice cut through. "Hold it." Calm, firm, carrying more weight than any radio. The room froze again. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. The officer hesitated, then stopped. The speaker was one of the three presiding judges, the one in the middle with half-rimmed glasses. He'd been quiet all morning. Now his eyes were sharper than his robe. "Check her identification," he said, voice steady. He wasn't doubting her. He'd just realized what happened wasn't a random outburst. If he misread this, the system could implode. The officer approached slowly. No rush, no shouts. The silence had shifted into something else, a readiness to really listen. She reached into her inner jacket pocket, not for a summons or standard ID, but a small square leather wallet. She flipped it open with the ease of long habit and extended it. The officer opened it. His expression changed instantly. Brows lifted, fingers stiffened. Then he closed it gently and handed it back. No need to say the name out loud. The black badge inside, with raised lettering and unmistakable seal, said enough. Special Operations, clearance authorized for independent investigation. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers interlocking. His face shifted. She wasn't just a random witness. Her actions weren't the desperate swing of a civilian pushed past her limit. They fit inside her mandate and were delivered by someone who knew exactly where she stood in this structure. Rourke still slumped on the floor, fury flushing beneath his shame. He'd thought she was nobody. A name he could mispronounce, a life he could shrug off. He hadn't prepared for the woman he mocked to be one of the very people empowered to audit his career. Maybe she already had. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no chant. Change rarely needs noise. It needs timing, a voice in the right place, an ID in the right hand, one act that leaves the system with nowhere comfortable to stand. A woman had dropped a badge to the floor with 2 clean strikes, then balanced the scales with a card, not for glory, but as a reminder. The law isn't a weapon for the powerful. It's supposed to catch everyone, including those dismissed. The wallet hadn't even disappeared back into her pocket when every eye caught the words on its front. U.S. Navy SEAL. Clearance Level 4. 3 short lines, heavy enough to crush every lazy excuse from people who'd laughed or sat still. From prosecution benches to the tiny press row, silence deepened, not from shock, but from awakening. The woman Rourke had introduced as black, female, civilian, unknown employment history was nothing of the kind. She'd once made life or death calls in combat zones. Now she'd been forced to defend herself from someone in the same uniform color. She swept the room with her eyes, not with contempt, but with clarity that demanded everyone face their silence. When she spoke again, no one dared look away. "I defended this country," she said. "Today I had to defend myself from someone wearing its badge." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of someone who'd accepted a brutal truth and still refused to retreat. Each word cut clean, a truth nobody wanted, none could deny. In a place built to represent justice, a soldier had just been treated like trash because of her skin. An older lawyer rubbed his forehead, not tired, ashamed. A clerk's hands shook over the keys. Rourke sagged against the bench, head lowered, not from injury but because he'd been stripped. Power, image, all of it, by an undeniable fact. Her card wasn't a threat. It was evidence the country's defenders come home to fight new battles. Battles against men in familiar uniforms, pledging allegiance to the same flag. Worse, those fights happened in silence until blood hit the courtroom floor and justice looked away. She didn't step forward or back. She stood rooted in the center of that moral storm. Her presence, rank, identity, and unflinching calm reduced everyone else's titles to paper scraps. No one brought up protocol. No one asked, was that authorized? Because every flimsy authorization had just been burned by a single, unshakable truth. Power without integrity always hunts for escape routes. This time, it had none. Everyone understood they wouldn't leave this room the same. They'd watched someone who held the front lines be insulted in open court and still say clearly, "I don't need permission to defend myself." Less than 2 hours later, the story hit the outside world. It started as a short, anonymous post with a blurry but unmistakable clip. Rourke stumbling backward, badge spinning, a black woman standing solid. The caption, "Navy SEAL assaulted mid-trial." Within half an hour, Black Navy SEAL attacked in court shot up social feeds. The narrative slipped out of the courthouse's hands and any internal chain of command. Major outlets piled in with different angles, all circling the same center. A service member who'd once protected the country quietly had been humiliated and assaulted by someone claiming to uphold justice. Reporters dug fast. Once Rourke's name surfaced, dusty files cracked open. Old complaints came crawling back into the light. 5 years earlier, a teenager had accused him of coercion during questioning. The case disappeared in a week. 3 years ago, a staff report mentioned racial slurs during roll call, dismissed for lack of evidence. Last year, a black driver accused him of dragging her from her car. A buddy of Rourke's signed the witness statement. In every incident, nobody was disciplined. Nobody resigned. One columnist wrote, "Protected and still patrolling," and the line hit harder than any official indictment. In under a day, Rourke became a symbol, not of order, but of rot under the badge. People started asking, how many more like him are still out there? How many complaints got buried because challenging law enforcement is risky? And if that video didn't exist, what then? Headlines multiplied. An evening news host opened. She defended our country. Who defends her at home? Old footage of Rourke's interviews played side by side with complaints and the courtroom audio. His phrase, "black female civilian," became evidence, not routine. Former defenders fell silent. Old group photos disappeared. A legal team that once blasted internal reform issued a weak statement. "We do not condone violence." Too late. She, the woman once treated like a shadow, had become the center of a reckoning, not because she cried on camera or delivered speeches, but because she held her ground. Somewhere in a rushed emergency meeting, someone who usually looked away finally said, "Real accountability." Out loud. Invitations poured in. She turned them down. She didn't sit on talk shows or sell her story. She stayed quiet, not to protect anyone, but to protect the truth from being chopped into sound bites. On the gray stone wall, west of the courthouse, someone finally sprayed the line. She didn't break the silence. She didn't break silence. She beat it. Big block letters, wet black paint still shining. No camera caught the writer, but everyone felt it came straight from her spine. No signature, no hashtag, no demand. Still, the whole city knew exactly who those words pointed to. By evening, that line was everywhere. Screens, notebooks, whispered conversations. Within a day, it appeared on protest signs, in student group chats, inked onto a small circle of law grads' arms, and italicized at the end of a rights editorial. She, the calm storm center, never stepped into a studio, never accepted an interview. One former teammate, asked about her, only said, "She's carried silence through things you'd never handle." Her absence didn't cool the wildfire, it changed its direction. People stopped arguing only about her and started dissecting silence itself, the kind forced on those ignored for decades. They realized she hadn't spoken to be famous. She'd moved because, for once, the abuser's microphone had been knocked from his hand. That strike wasn't choreography. It was raw declaration. The city council quickly ordered the west wall repainted, but locals blocked the maintenance trucks quietly, standing in the way with steady faces and unshaken patience. No chants, no banners. They brought brick pieces instead, each hand scratched with words like, "For her, not just a witness. Don't erase this." Brick by brick, they ringed the wall's base, unmoving. Maybe sensing the tide had shifted beyond control, officials backed off. An internal note summed it up with one dry sentence. Postponed due to public safety concerns. Everyone knew why. So the wall stayed, paint untouched, the line left intact. A rare public surface the government no longer dared sanitize because its message weighed more than city ordinances. Over time, folks stopped pointing at it. They just walked differently around that stone, held doors longer, watched more closely, refused to laugh off cruelty. The words had already sunk in. The hashtag, "Silence Strikes Back," appeared from a blank profile, no bio, no followers. One photo, black paint on that stone wall. 3 words in the caption. No branding, no logo. Within an hour, it surged across platforms. First among law students, then veterans, then communities tired of yelling into voids. It didn't feel like a campaign, more like a thought finally typed. "Silence Strikes Back" wasn't a peace slogan. It was a warning. What people have swallowed for years can return, unscheduled, aimed straight at those who lived off their quiet. No chants, no manifestos, just a promise that forced silence doesn't vanish. It hardens. Eventually, it moves, because those silenced know. Sometimes not speaking is the loudest stance. Online forums retold the story, but almost no one called her a hero. There were no triumphant soundtracks, no poetic headlines about justice restored, no triumphant movie trailers. Instead, people wrote like they were confessing, owning slivers of blame for letting it slide, for watching Rourke act unchecked, for once accepting, "That's just how this place works." One post read, "I watched a black woman dragged from her car for not making eye contact during a stop. I stood nearby. I said nothing. If she'd been my sister." A veteran teacher wrote, "I've put, she didn't break silence, she beat it on my board." I'm not glorifying her. I'm telling my students silence is collaboration too. The story didn't spread like branding. It traveled like a recovered memory. Shaky, painful, unstoppable. It didn't exist to glorify her, but to remind everyone silence has a body count. People didn't build monuments. They remembered corners, checkpoints, metal detectors, the guardrails where someone sneered, "Trash," or "You people," and walked away unchallenged. Those details refused to fade this time. That way of telling kept the narrative from dissolving within weeks. It left the headlines, but slipped into school assemblies, essay prompts, youth workshops, and yes, mandatory justice system trainings. One office even swapped the words over its entrance from integrity, honor, service, to never let silence in. In a city addicted to hollow outrage, this story became a mirror. Not a reflection of her, but of everyone who'd watched something wrong and swallowed it down. That's why the hashtag outlived trends. It captured a moment when the untouchable finally cracked. By then, the story belonged to more than just the woman who struck back. It belonged to every person who'd once gone quiet, looked away, or promised themselves they'd speak next time. A week later, buried under piles of furious emails and think pieces, a small message slid through the court's internal server. The sender, a mid-level admin, anonymous to the public. Subject, resignation. Body, one short paragraph. I saw it. I stayed quiet. No dramatic justification. No timeline. Just enough honesty to make the locked doors behind the system creak. Words written in private hit differently when they come from someone who sat next to justice long enough to know silence eventually stops being a choice and turns into collusion. Her name was changed in internal chatter to Denise. For 4 years, she'd transcribed hearings under Rourke's watch, fingers moving, face invisible behind dusty glass, pretending neutral was possible. She still remembered last October when Rourke dragged in a 19-year-old, cuffs chafing, knees bloodied from those courthouse steps. The kid kept repeating he'd come to file rehab completion papers. Denise watched him from behind her machine, saw his hand tremble as he tried speaking, then freeze when he met Rourke's eyes. Eyes that said, "I own what happens next." Rourke yanked him from the bench like excess baggage. His voice boomed. "This type is a walking infection, reeks of southern gutter filth." The judge flipped pages, never looking up. That day, the cameras were down for maintenance. The boy disappeared down the hallway. Denise submitted the transcript. When it came back, social virus had become disruptive civilian near courtroom. She silently corrected punctuation, signed her name, filed it. She stayed quiet until she watched that same man folded on the floor, dropped by someone he'd expected to crush. Seeing him sprawled beneath the witness, surrounded by frozen faces, snapped something. Denise realized it was too late to fix yesterday, but not too late to stop endorsing it with her silence. Besides her short resignation email, she left one unsent sticky note on her desk. "I thought avoiding trouble was responsible. Turns out I was helping trouble breathe." The note never hit the headlines, but her email did. In 2 days, everyone in the building knew she'd walked away. No fanfare, no legal threat. Just enough to sting. Nobody begged her to reconsider. She didn't want sympathy or a spotlight. She wanted distance. From the chair that turned pain into sanitized sentences. Distance from counterfeit justice written in official fonts. If she's remembered at all, it'll be for finally pushing back from that desk, choosing to leave rather than keep letting other people's damage be softened under her name. Denise never held press conferences. Her inbox refused interviews. Yet her resignation letter traveled farther than many televised speeches. The last line carried no thanks, no polite closer. Just this: I refuse to grow old, explaining to my grandchild why I kept my mouth shut. That screenshot spread faster than most evening broadcasts, not boosted, just forwarded, copied, and screenshotted. What caught people wasn't clever phrasing or polished rhetoric, it was how brutally simple it was. In a world addicted to performance, 10 unadorned words cut deeper than whole op-eds. A young public defender reposted it, then a high school teacher. Soon, dozens of community pages. Within 24 hours, "Why I Stayed Silent" banners appeared at over a dozen peaceful rallies. No one said Denise on stage, but everyone understood. Somewhere, someone who'd once kept quiet had finally walked away from their post and left a question the system couldn't dodge. While major outlets chewed on official statements and legal panels, that one letter made regular people pause. It didn't dissect statutes. It asked the only question that mattered: how long? How long do we keep choosing comfort over truth? People started asking how many other Denises sat behind courtroom doors, patrol desks, admin counters, watching, editing, deleting, convincing themselves they had no choice. What had they seen but never logged? What had been relabeled, softened, or quietly dropped in return boxes? How many would someday face a grandchild's questions about why they stayed quiet? Denise answered no follow-ups. Phone off, inbox closed. When someone checked with an old coworker, she shrugged softly. "She's gone," she said. "Best call she's made in a decade." The local paper, late to the story, ran a reader column titled "The Quiet Choice of a Court Clerk." They couldn't ignore what less than 10 words had set loose. From then on, whenever reform came up, people didn't quote big cases or election speeches. They muttered, "Somebody said she didn't want to explain her silence to her grandkid." That sentence stopped belonging to one clerk. It slid onto the desks of hundreds, sitting beside ID badges and staplers like a small, sharp blade laid next to official seals. Somewhere online, another clip surfaced. A man in a washed-out gray t-shirt leaned against a brick wall, speaking plainly. No dramatic music, no tears. "He smashed my head into pavement," he said, "all because I asked where the bus stop was." His voice was steady. Within 2 hours, dozens more stories poured out. Different cities, ages, but the same refrains. "I knew him. That was me." Screenshots of old citations appeared. Copies of complaints stamped "received," then ignored. An old audio recording leaked. Rourke's voice snarling. "Who exactly are you calling? I'm the law here." Over 170 anonymous statements hit public watchdog platforms in one day. Reports once dismissed as resolved internally or expired now reappeared, shielded by anonymity and carried by a changed audience. Law students built an interactive timeline. In 48 hours, they published a digital map showing every spot tied to Rourke's coercion, intimidation, or racial slurs. Courthouse, bus stops, school zones, housing blocks. Yellow pins glowed like overdue warnings. "If justice bends this easily on every corner," one student wrote beneath the map, "why would anyone still believe it stands at all?" At a closed meeting between oversight boards and city police brass, this thick report sat on the table. Nearly 200 pages. No one defended Rourke, not even the city attorney. The hush in that room wasn't confusion. It was the silence of people finally forced to realize this wasn't stress or a bad week. It was design, cultivated, protected. The statements from people once labeled uncooperative now formed the strongest case. It stopped being about one man's cruelty. It became about the scaffolding that fed him power and asked nothing back. One mother didn't file forms. She just posted an old snapshot, her 9-year-old son in a black hoodie, backpack clutched. "He got called Lost Monkey right beside me," she wrote. Name of the officer? Rourke. His crime? Wearing a hoodie. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. Her restraint felt heavier than fury, like anger she'd had to camouflage for years. When she'd gone to the station, the desk officer asked, "Got proof?" She raised her phone. Rourke smirked. "Next time, teach him how to dress if he wants respect." She went home silent. Next day, too. When her son asked, "Are you mad?" she whispered yes, then took him for ice cream instead of war, afraid of more labels. It was the last time he wore that hoodie outside. When the courtroom video went viral, she didn't cheer at the blow or the fall. She felt something else. Recognition. Someone had finally moved. For all the families who'd swallowed insults to avoid more damage. Hundreds followed, telling their own stories. None famous, none in uniform. All convinced nobody would care. They described getting pulled from lines, singled out for IDs, trailed through rich neighborhoods, ticketed for existing. Things they'd long filed under the cost of being left alone. Now, seeing someone refuse that cost, they decided they no longer wanted to pay it quietly. A comment repeated under thousands of posts. We all stayed silent, thinking we were alone. Now someone hit back. Not because violence is holy, but because sometimes that's the one language a deaf system hears. Even those who hated fighting understood exactly what it meant. Law students launched a site archiving complaints tied to Rourke and his protectors, under reason for sharing, a new option, because someone finally acted. Ordinary people clicked it repeatedly. You didn't have to be a warrior. You didn't need a title. People spoke up not to rewrite yesterday, but to rewire themselves, so look away stopped being the default. One post read, "I've been slapped, mocked for my name, pulled aside for keeping quiet. I used to think silence kept me safe. Now I know it just kept them comfortable." In these testimonies, nobody called themselves victims. They used their own names, unflinching, unqualified. Dignity, once stained, reassembled itself sentence by sentence, story by story. They weren't proving anything. They were remembering. Predictably, the system tried an old move. Rourke's lawyer stepped to a podium backed by microphones and neutral backdrops, clean suit, iron tie, voice polished by years of courtroom theater. "My client was brutally assaulted while carrying out his duties," he declared. Headlines echoed, "Officer attacked in court." But the public had changed. This script didn't land like it used to. He waved medical reports. Minor concussion, hematoma, level 2 psychological trauma. Scan images flashed on screens, but trauma claims rang hollow next to the lives he'd ground down for years. A former military doctor commented, "A man who terrorized others now claiming emotional injury? That's not medicine, that's theater." The narrative split, law versus memory, paperwork versus lived experience. A hospital photo showed Rourke's bandaged hand. Underneath, thousands posted screenshots of his past phrases, each captioned, "This is the only wound I recognize." His pain felt tiny beside theirs. A retired teacher wrote, "He once got an 8th grader expelled for saying, 'Good morning,' too flat. Now he cries trauma. What about the kids he taught to fear authority forever?" This backlash didn't come from outrage alone. It came from collective memory finally refusing to bend. No panel or MRI could overwrite what people had seen and survived. On a live show, one woman stood, voice shaking but steady. If that punch broke him, he should count how many of us those hands forced to the floor. No one talked about Rourke's honor or long service anymore. Those phrases sounded ridiculous now. What he faced wasn't vengeance, it was consequence. His lawyer's shield only highlighted the rot underneath. The courtroom is supposed to be where truth wins, but in the days after, what surfaced wasn't truth. It was precision, selective truth, carefully trimmed to protect uniforms and titles. Rourke's team insisted, "We're here to judge that one incident, not his entire character." Mainstream outlets swallowed that frame. The public didn't. Screenshots of old internal chat logs appeared instead. In one thread, he typed about black protesters: shoot a couple rounds overhead, toss stale food, they'll scatter. In another, he posted a monkey emoji, captioned, brown folks wanting rights again. Those messages never made it into official evidence. When a reporter asked why, the defense replied, irrelevant to this case. For once people saw the law wasn't blind, it was choosing. A young activist tweeted, hard truth, the law doesn't fail because it can't see. It fails because it pretends not to. That line ended up on shirts, laptops, subway walls. No one expected the court to accept the old chats. That refusal became proof of the gap between what's true and what's allowed to stand behind a polished courtroom seal. A former cop wrote anonymously, I worked with Rourke. Off camera was worse. We laughed it off. I'm ashamed it took this long to call it what it was. His name became shorthand, not just for abuse, but for selective justice. For a system draped in fairness that always seemed to flinch when the blood wasn't on civilian hands. A local paper headlined, not the first time, but maybe the last. Underneath, they listed 8 prior complaints stamped away with phrases like insufficient proof, withdrawn, no action needed. Nobody waited for another trial to form an opinion. Verdicts settled in people's bodies, in every cautious glance at officers, every mispronounced name, every decision to swallow anger to stay alive. One elderly woman commented, first time my voice felt like it mattered. She remembered Rourke searching her at a market, accusing her of stealing food. When she asked why, he said, suspicions plenty. No one claimed justice had finally prevailed. But everyone seemed to grasp the same truth. Silence had become impossible. When the law refused to look straight, people had learned to point themselves. A week after the punch, the conversation shifted. Institutions that were supposed to defend truth began to go quiet. Veteran organizations, usually cautious, did the opposite. They stepped forward. Several national veteran groups signed a joint petition demanding a fully independent investigation, not run by internal affairs, not filtered through local politics, but externally monitored from top to bottom. The federal press secretary offered nothing. Justice Department spokespeople repeated, we are gathering facts and have no comment. Each repetition felt less like caution, more like a practiced dodge. As the government hesitated, military-affiliated media quietly pulled old pieces praising special operations women, including archived mentions of her. Online, one forum moderator wrote, to remain neutral, we're removing controversial profiles. That neutrality made people angrier than the punch itself. A former teammate, now mid-40s, posted an open letter. Neutrality isn't silence. Neutrality is asking questions when a protector gets humiliated by those sworn to uphold justice. Her letter went viral. Traditional outlets mostly ignored it, but the more official voices went quiet, the more everyday people copied, screenshotted, and quoted it in conversations offline. She, the operative at the center, never appeared. No clarifying Instagram, no press statements, no corrections. Her silence turned into a mirror people were forced to look into. The more institutions tried to scrub her name, the more others hunted for it. An independent journalist launched a podcast on Black women in the military, erased once they returned home. In episode 1, he said, she isn't the only one wronged, she's just the first who froze an entire room full of power by simply refusing to shrink. In old training tapes, her call sign still flashed briefly. In official systems, she'd never existed. Media offices refused comment. A fellow trainer asked about her, said only, no comment, eyes colder than his voice. One retired instructor wrote on a restricted forum, if a woman who took a bullet for her team gets erased for standing her ground at home, what's wounded isn't just her, it's our moral core. The post was removed for creating internal division within 3 hours. But the screenshots had already escaped, landing in group chats, newsletters, and late-night discussions about whose loyalty mattered. A question began to echo everywhere. If they can erase someone they once decorated, what do they need to erase us? No one could answer it without feeling the chill. Because deep down, people sensed the same thing. This system didn't sort right from wrong. It sorted obedient from inconvenient. Her courage had become conditional, redeemable until she pushed back. On campus, law students hosted an unofficial forum titled, "She Used to Be in the Curriculum, Where Is She Now?" They printed her redacted file and taped copies around the room. No microphones, no keynote, just slips of paper passed out. Write how you'd feel if your name vanished from something you bled to build. The notes piled up fast. One message was photographed more than any other. We're not defending one person. We're fighting forced forgetting, because that's how systems dodge consequences and turn disgrace into dust. Memory refused to behave. It kept ripping past carefully placed narrative patches. She never stepped forward to demand they undelete her. She let the erasure stand as proof of what they feared. Because if their image required wiping her out, that image wasn't worth saving. And anyone who'd ever believed in it had to reevaluate exactly what they'd been defending. In a modest high school auditorium back east, a discussion labeled "Response in the Law" drew a handful of juniors and a tired-looking history teacher. No officials, no cameras, just questions. On the board, "What happens if you stay quiet?" The projector showed a heavily edited summary of the Rourke case. No blood, no punch. Just one last slide. She finally responded. Afterward, a white student stood, brow furrowed. What would have happened if she hadn't hit back? The room went still. The teacher stared at the blurred image before answering. Probably. Nobody would know, she said quietly. The words felt like a blade, slicing through the comfortable fiction that restraint alone ever changed anything in places built to ignore you. One girl whispered, "So if she'd stayed quiet, it just disappears?" Her friend muttered, "Not disappears, it just repeats." The teacher nodded, confirming this wasn't theory. It was pattern. When you're degraded, pulled from your seat, mocked, she said, and you say nothing, people assume it's normal. The system keeps doing it, just to the next person. A quiet, black student at the back stood. So reacting is wrong, but silence fixes nothing. How are we judged either way? The teacher had no clean answer. She turned and wrote beneath the question, already on the board. What happens if you don't? The class understood. Their choices weren't neat, but neither was pretending blindness. That weekend, a 30-second clip hit social media. Classroom hum, fluorescent buzz, shaky footage. The opening caption, "What if she hadn't fought back?" Then the teacher's soft voice. Probably nobody would know. Within 2 days, it hit millions of views. People reposted it with the same caption, "We don't know," because we all got used to shut mouths. Another hashtag formed, "She fought back." Under the tag, confession after confession. I saw it and froze. My brother got stomped in holding. Nobody believed him. I was 17 when they dragged my dad away. I just stood there. No organization coordinated it. These stories threaded themselves together, each one a fractured link in a chain of silence that finally, painfully, began to show its full length. Meanwhile, in a gated suburb near the courthouse, Rourke holed up inside his apartment. No protest line outside, no spray paint, no broken windows. Just a new, heavy quiet. The corner store removed his name from the rewards board. Cashiers avoided his eyes. Once he heard someone near the cereal aisle whisper, "That's him, right?" He left his cart where it stood. No charges had landed. Complaints sat under review. Old clips were dismissed as inconclusive. On official records, not much had shifted. In real life, control had slipped from his hands. Power had migrated to the people who used to look down, now looking up, into the way they watched his footsteps, the way they didn't step aside to let him pass. He learned the feeling he'd given others for years, unwelcome by default, viewed as danger just by walking down a sidewalk. Silence around him no longer meant respect. It spelled rejection. He started bolting his front door before sunset. Curtains stayed closed. One afternoon, a kid's ball rolled into his yard. The child stared, then sprinted away. Nobody told them to. Somewhere, they'd seen his name flash across a noisy screen and felt instinctive danger. The official file said no findings. The neighborhood said stay clear. Those two truths didn't match anymore. A few blocks from the federal building, a small print shop known for birthday shirts suddenly faced an order for over 5,000 tees. One phrase, "She didn't wait to be protected." Black fabric, blunt white letters, no fancy font. People drove hours to pick them up. One older woman's hands shook as she paid for a single shirt she promised to wear daily. "To work, to the market, past the precinct," she said. They weren't buying merch. They were putting language to the anger they'd swallowed so long it had turned to stone. Soon another tag spread. "Not waiting for permission." Under it, raw statements poured in. "I used to fear speaking up. Now I'm more scared of what happens if I don't." On an aging brick wall by the courthouse, an unknown street artist painted a mural overnight. Her back visible, face lost in sunlight, braids neat, shoulders squared, walking forward. Behind her, a shadowed SEAL silhouette. Helmet, rifle slung. In front of her, Rourke's shadow sprawled. Badge tossed, holster cracked. Below, a caption. "Sometimes, justice needs a hit to wake up." Morning commuters slowed, phones lifting. A kid clutching bread stared. An office worker wiped her cheeks. Few spoke. The street fell into a different silence, one that remembered instead of pretending. Authorities debated removal. No permit, public property. The cleanup crew hesitated. A younger officer told his superior, "If I paint over that, someone will film it. I'm not being next on the wrong side." No plaque was ever hung, no official designation as art. Still, the street filled daily with people stopping for a heartbeat, standing there, then leaving a little less willing to bow. Not because she was a mythic hero, but because she demonstrated one thing clearly. You don't need a title to push back. You just need one moment when you don't move. A week later, at a quiet cafe south of downtown, 5 women met around a scarred wooden table. Single mothers, different jobs, one shared ache. No one had defended their kids. The punch didn't frighten them. It pushed them. They decided no one should have to stand alone like that again. From a group chat, an idea formed. Citizens Self-Defense Network. No paperwork, no funding, just a restless page that hit 20,000 followers in 3 days. Messages poured in. "Can we join? We need this where we live." They drafted a handbook, Legal Self-Defense, how to record audio, log badge numbers, spot real warrants, call witnesses loudly, and use phone cameras within your rights. Each page was shared everywhere. Their main message was simple. Not all of us can fight like she did, but we can all refuse to be flattened again. That line became their pinned post. Across state lines, a father named Malcolm Price wrote one sentence on his feed. "I'm teaching my daughter to shout back, not drop her eyes." 30,000 shares followed. Under his post came photos, parents showing kids practicing self-defense, learning to record, learning how to say, "I don't consent," clearly. Malcolm wasn't an activist, just a delivery driver with old scars. He'd once been ordered face down on hot asphalt because his van matched a suspect's. He'd thought about suing, but backed off after friends warned, "They'll watch you." He kept quiet until the courtroom clip. In the operative's eyes, he saw his own long-buried anger. He realized if he taught his daughter submission, he couldn't look her in the eye later. Coaches wrote his line on locker room boards. Teachers taped it above classroom doors. It stopped being a complaint and became strategy. Either you answer or you accept being stepped on. No single act had ever stalled the country's attention like that punch. It wasn't the sound of impact. It was the sight of her standing, unshaken, among uniforms who thought they were the law. Her sentence echoed, "I don't need your permission to stand." Parents, teachers, workers turned it inward, asking, "Am I still waiting for someone else to stand up for me?" When the formal response finally appeared, it came printed in bland black ink on plain white paper. Title: Regarding Internal Review of Conduct Policies in Local Judicial Venues. 2 short paragraphs said the Justice Department had received citizen feedback and was assessing professional standards. No use of the word assault, no mention of Rourke, no acknowledgement of her as anything but a citizen. He became an involved officer. She, a litigating participant. That linguistic eraser wasn't clumsy. It was deliberate. Strip away names and accountability dissolves into abstract incidents nobody owns. People read it and burned. I reread 3 times, one attorney wrote. Nobody is responsible in this document. A former investigative reporter added, if choking a witness gets called an incident, you know what side they've picked. A tweet paired the phrase currently reviewing with a photo of the courtroom captioned, while they review, people keep dying quietly. It spread as the unofficial summary of bureaucratic indifference. Soon folks online started calling her the one they won't name, not to strip her identity, but to spotlight the system's terror of speaking it. Her absence became their evidence. She never asked to be remembered. Yet from that day on, every time someone was shoved, mocked, or cornered, there was a new reflex in the room, a quiet readiness to step forward instead of back. For those of us old enough to remember black and white TV, church basement meetings, and the long road from Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Act, this story of the black woman Navy SEAL in that courtroom is a painful déjà vu. You've seen versions of Officer Rourke before, men who hide cruelty behind a badge and a smooth report. Lesson 1 is simple and bitter. Silence is not safety. Every clerk who looked away, every juror who pretended not to see, made his hand on her shoulder feel heavier. Many of us were taught, keep your head down and you'll be left alone. This story reminds us, looking away just gives abuse more room to grow. Lesson 2, self-defense is not disrespect. That swift, clean strike that dropped him was not a tantrum. It was the last line in the sand after years of being treated as less than human, even after serving her country. You and I know the difference between picking every fight and choosing the one moment when you simply cannot let it slide anymore, for your own dignity and for the young eyes watching. Lesson 3, our choices ripple farther than we ever see. A clerk resigns. A wall keeps its graffiti. Teachers write, she didn't break silence, she beat it on their boards. Grandparents quietly decide they will not tell their grandkids, I saw it and said nothing. At our age, that might be the truest power we still hold, to model that it's never too late to stop cooperating with cruelty, even if all we do is finally speak up. Friends, especially those of you in your 60s, 70s, and beyond, this story isn't just about a punch in a courtroom. It's about all the moments in our lives when we saw something wrong and either stepped in or stayed quiet. If you had been sitting on those benches with your years of experience and your grandchildren in mind, what do you believe the right response would have been? Have you ever regretted staying silent or been proud you finally spoke up? Share your thoughts in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so we can keep learning, healing, and growing together.